All right. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Happy Science Week. My name is, I heard one woo, great. My name is Shane Lorden and I'm the Senior Local Lead for Una Europa at University College Dublin. Una Europa is our European University Alliance, consisting of 11 partner universities across Europe, working together to build the University of the Future. Tonight's event is brought to you by Una Europa, the Insight Centre for Data Analytics based here at UCD, and the Dublin European Institute. Speaking of the future, it is wonderful to see so many people here with an interest in the topic of AI and ethics. We have a fantastic panel lined up for you tonight, and our moderator is the award-winning tech journalist, Elaine Burke. I also see plenty of students in the audience. If you're interested in getting involved with Una Europa here at UCD, we have a very active student association, and there are a lot of things for you to get stuck into. You can find out more on our website, and you can scan the QR code that's on the screen to learn more. I will now hand over to Elaine, and let's give our panel a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Shane. I am Elaine Burke. I'm here as your moderator. Ideally, you won't hear a lot from me tonight, and I'll be giving lots of space to our panelists to speak. I am a science and technology journalist and currently the host of two podcasts, both focused on technology. One is called For Tech's Sake, and we're starting a new season as of tomorrow with the researchers from Connect, the Research Ireland Centre for Future Networks and Communications. And we're going to be looking at intersections of science, technology and society in that mini-series. And I also co-host the Connected AI podcast, which will be coming out fortnightly the following Wednesday, and looks to explain this AI business and what it's all about, how businesses might apply it as well. For more on any of those things, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram. I hardly use X anymore. Who does? I don't know. But that's enough about me. Let's get to our panelists. So please welcome Dr. Adam Kelly, Associate Professor in the UCD School of English since 2020. He has authored 2 books on American fiction and has also published on Irish literature and political theory, among other topics. He is currently leading a research team as principal investigator on a project comparing contemporary literature from the US, Russia, Ukraine, and Ireland as an effort to further our understanding of social trust in the digital age. And his broader research interests take in the relationships between literature, philosophy, politics, and economics. Beside Adam, we have Dr. Mina Hosseini, an experienced lawyer and consultant, and as a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Research Fellow at the UCD School of Law, she has conducted research into the consistency of applying EU competition law and policy in the pharmaceutical sector before, during, and after a crisis, focusing on lessons learned from the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Outside of competition law and pharmaceutical policy, her research interests also include health law and AI in healthcare, and she is a member of the UCD Discovery AI Healthcare Hub. Beside Mina is Dr. Susan Levy, an assistant professor at UCD's School of Information and Communication Studies, working in AI ethics, trustworthy AI, and text analytics. She is currently working on projects to mitigate bias and discrimination in AI and is developing a platform to evaluate the social impact of recommender algorithms. She is also a member of the Irish Government's AI Advisory Council and an Irish delegate at the Global Partnership on AI, which is an OECD initiative to promote responsible AI that respects human rights and democratic values. And finally, we have Dr. Brian McNamee, Associate Professor at the UCD School of Computer Science. Brian was recently appointed the UCD Site Director of the Insight Research Centre and is also co-director of ML Labs, the Centre for Research and Training in Machine Learning, and a director of the AI training company Chrysalis. And his own research interests are about putting people and their expertise at the heart of AI. So as you can see, they've got the credentials. They may be familiar faces to a lot of you in the room if you are UCD students, probably their students. But the title of this talk is The Future is Now, AI, Ethics and You, presumably you in the room. And I know there's a mix of students and educators alike here and educators on our panel. So I think we'll start with what might be relevant to this audience in terms of AI and ethics. What about the use of AI tools as students, particularly Gen AI? What are your concerns there? We'll start with Adam to get things off on a positive note.
Oh, okay. Ask the humanities guy. Well, my interest is mainly in LLMs, I'll be honest, when it comes to the new AI wave. As someone who works with language and who teaches the language arts, you know, I can recognize that LLMs large language models are a really huge innovation in the history of both in the history of computing, but also in the history of language and what language can do, how we understand language, what its relationship is to calculation and data. It overturns quite a lot of our understanding historically of what computing is and what language is, and that's very exciting. The worry, and it is a worry, is that the use of this technology in the current climate is that it will substitute for the work that students would otherwise do with language. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned with this and that I haven't seen a lot of evidence of it, that there might be more learning loss coming with this than actually learning gain. I think that for me, as a humanities person, language is very central to who we are as people, and it's not something that we can outsource. It's something we can literally seem to be able to outsource to machines. But if we want to remain who we are at some fundamental level, we need to generate language ourselves and continue to do it. And so that's kind of where I'm coming up from this at a fundamental level.
Well, because language is like, it's more than just an output from a machine. It's something kind of lived and learned. And on the learning side of it, I know you have experience of how people might be trying to do an analysis that tells you what you want to hear. I want you to share that anecdote with the room now.
Yeah, I mean, so when this all kicked off for most of us in late 2022, early 2023, with the release of ChatGPT, soon after that, it became clear that I and along with a lot of other people needed to get on top of this, needed to understand what was going on. Things are moving very fast. The fear that we always live with as lecturers is that our students are going to be miles ahead of us on tech, which is usually the case. But I am the convener of a module called Critical Theory, which is taken by all English literature second year students. So one of the things I did last year was I did some research and designed some new lectures around surveillance capitalism, language, computing, and all of that. And as part of that, I designed a new assessment that asked students to compare a famous poem by Seamus Heaney, The Forge, some of you will know it, with a poem written by ChatGPT about a blacksmith in the style of Seamus Heaney. So the idea was to see what the differences would be and what students thought the differences would be and how they would analyze those differences. And I have to say, this is on the positive side, it produced some of the very best answers I've seen from students, because they really had to kind of really think hard, a lot of them did, about what is the difference between a human using language and a machine using language. But the less good answers, and there were many of these too, relied on the assumption that there was a difference without actually being able to prove what that difference was. So saying something like, it just feels like Heaney's poem is written by a human, and it just feels like the ChatGPT is written by a machine. And, that's always going to be the way. Humans will always, it'll always be clear when humans are using language versus when machines are using language. Actually, it's not. And that's what's so interesting. It's becoming less and less clear. Maybe for Seamus Heaney, but anywhere further down the scale, the complexity is a kind of Turing test of, can you actually tell? And that's where things are very interesting. And that's where I think we, as people who teach language, really need to kind of think hard about how we're going to get across those differences as they still exist and how to talk about them.
There's like a different era of CAPTCHA emerging there, where instead of a robot trying to tell if we're humans trying to tell if a robot is a robot. I don't know.
Yeah.
We're in a whole
or whether we're robots.
Yeah, we're in a whole new sphere now.
It's the Blade Runners.
Yeah. But Susan, like in the School of ICT that you're coming from, I mean, you're probably trying to be at the forefront of educational technologies and things like that. And Adam has an example there of, how having a way of bringing this into the classroom that's not necessarily saying, take it and write your essays with it, but like, let's have a discussion about it. Let's do something with it. And I know your colleague on the advisory council, Professor Alan Smeaton, has used an AI to develop a teaching assistant for his students. So like, there's ways that educators can put this to use as well.
Absolutely, there is. Alan is doing some really innovative, brilliant work in DCU for sure. I do think there are different requirements for different disciplines. So it is more challenging in the area of English literature and philosophy to use these technologies, because people need to read books, and when you can get summaries and summaries of summaries, it's just becomes more and more challenging to actually spend the time reading. So a summary won't do, but in different disciplines it could be really useful in different ways. there are ways. The technologies the tools at the moment, it would be great perhaps to see something really innovative, maybe a language model. In an ideal world, perhaps you had universities partnering and creating their own model, and then lecturers could safely perhaps create those kind of course materials, because at the moment it's fragmented. People don't know, you're uploading stuff, you don't know where it's going, and maybe students have their own subscriptions to different models, you don't know which, so it's a bit fragmented. So there's a lot of work to do to be able to reap the benefits and the possibilities of it, and there are, for sure. And there are test cases out there in the US where universities have really embraced this, but we've a bit of work to do.
Yeah, I think the Harvard Computer Science Department has also done something similar in terms of like putting their course material basically into a chatbot that students can then convene with and ask the question that they didn't want to be embarrassed by asking in class, and things like that are opened up for them. But Brian, how does that make you feel? Because like you're doing training in like things like machine learning and stuff like that. You've literally written a book on it. And now they're talking about the possibility of plugging that book into large language models so that, people can just talk to a chatbot and learn what you took a long time to put together. So does this feel threatening to your job?
Completely. So yes, no. So I was telling you before, with a couple of colleagues, we wrote a textbook on machine learning with MIT Press. It came out a few years ago, and I got an email just this week asking, what do you think about this whole LLM thing, and should we sell the library to one of the LLM providers? And essentially the press was saying, we're just going to ask our authors what they all think. We haven't made any decisions yet. So I think on that, I think the computer science is interesting, and this has sort of flown under the radar a little bit, that sort of, to a certain extent, I guess, AI research and LLMs come out of computer science departments and lots of other departments as well. But the thing that I guess first got really good out of those was computer code. So to a certain extent, computer programmers programmed themselves out of a job before they programmed anybody else out of a job. But it's been really interesting to see basically how that's emerged and how people are using it for teaching, and how people are using then the new code generation tools that LLMs give them. So with teaching, there's a real benefit to being able to use those code generation tools to basically generate massive numbers of examples, massive numbers of sample exercises that students are getting a real benefit from. So a couple of colleagues in computer science have done some really nice work around that. So using code generation LLMs to generate sample questions for students. So rather than coming to the lecture saying we have some sample questions and me saying, well, here's 4, and I don't have any time to write any more, there's a nice system that can churn out almost an endless example of those. And I think as educators, one of the things that we got to try and flip ourselves around and I guess bring students around to this is that in a lot of cases, the outcome doesn't matter. So the 100 students who all write a version of the same kind of code in my class, those individual pieces of code, they don't really matter. It's the process of doing it and the thinking of doing it. So I think the students who embrace working with generative AI within that education context, they can have a really interesting experience of playing around with different ideas, getting, I suppose, inspired in some cases with different ideas. And if we can kind of turn people towards that rather than the shortcut of generate me the answer, I'm done, I think we can do some really interesting things.
But then, so we have a person like you who writes the book, or you guys being educators, world of experience, put that world of experience into a chatbot. The chatbot then becomes a teaching assistant. That's great, I think, in the short term. But then how do you get another you? How do you get another person who's built up that world of experience? Like, do we create gaps by doing this? Because I do know from researching automation in the piloting industry that they are seeing a skill erosion happening with pilots because they are trained to work in an automated system. When the system fails is probably when things are going to go quite badly in flight. Don't be worried. But it's just the analysis shows that there's a skills erosion happening. So how do we look forward and think long term in terms of this? That's for everybody on the panel.
Maybe give one example I came across that I thought was interesting around that is around writing and script writing. And I guess the example that was given was, LLMs won't generate a script in the style as good as, let's say, a great scriptwriter like Aaron Sorkin. But someone like him has to spend a lot of years writing episodes of Paw Patrol or something like that before they become that good. And an LLM will do a really good job at writing episodes of Paw Patrol right now because it's not that complicated.
Couldn't do Bluey though, I bet you.
True, no, definitely not.
Nope.
And I think it's finding the ways that we build, I guess, educational sort of programs for people, that we still make sure that we have those sort of foundational experiences that people go through. So going back to computer code, we've spent a long time thinking about that and how we build those educational experiences so that we still get those foundational skills and don't lose those.
And I want to bring you in, Mina, into the legal side of this, because creators are in this kind of pinch point now where they have to weigh up the option of plugging their content into these machines or unwittingly having their content already being plugged into them. So where do we stand in terms of like copyright and IP in respect of these generative AI models? And is there anything in current legislation that even nearly accounts for this?
Some of these laws are from like 200 years ago. And I guess for regulating something that is related to the 21st century, we need a new approach, a whole new approach, because in copyright laws in many jurisdictions, just humans can be like the owner of the material. And on the other side, these AI system, they cannot create something from the scratch. It's based on the training data, which most of them are copyrighted data. So we have like two sides. In one side, there are creators, there are copyright holders, but also there are publishers, for example. So they're not always the good guys versus the bad guys, because publishers also have these huge amounts of interest because of the work that creators, artists, they all generating for years. And on the other side, there are AI companies which they argue that this is an exception, this is a fair use of these copyright materials, and this is good for the society, the training data set, the richer, better for society. So there are like two parts of this argument, but I guess we need a new legal approach. Although some argue that no matter the technologies and advancements, no matter, we have these principles. So the principles cannot change after every single advancement. We have these principles, we have this institution, but we have to somehow adopt these institutions, principles to the new era of advancements. Yeah.
Because it's something we haven't had to consider before, to have kind of an unwritten rule about. But this idea that I could create something and put it online expecting it to reach an audience of maybe 5 people, but then that can become something that is abused in certain ways to create other content. And I have no control over that. I never signed up to that. I never even conceived of that happening when I made my little drawing or whatever it was that I did. But I think, like, ethically speaking, most people think that scale up and that kind of use of it, isn't good for creators. But I liked your point that the legal battles happening now are actually between 2 businesses that just want to make the profits out of this, because, But what it reminds me of then is the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes, because that was collective action from workers saying, I want to protect my work. I want to make sure that there's principles laid down in a contract that we will all be signed up to. That actually, and I don't know if anyone knows the outcome of that, essentially what it boils down to is that the writers and actors secured themselves some rights to use this technology, but not for the producers and the production companies and stuff like that to use it against them in a way. So is that what you're thinking when you're talking about principles that we need to move towards?
Yeah, and also this is a very good point. And also, I guess going towards an open sources AI would help this situation, because if you argue that this is fair use and it's for good for the society, so you have to show us some like goodwill here. So it has to be open sources, because when it's not open source, there's no transparency, there is no accountability from there. So
I just wanted to come in on SAG-AFTRA, because actually I think that's a really, really important case. And I think one of the things it shows is that creators have to unionize, essentially. That's what they did in that case, that they worked together to protect their image rights and against companies that essentially wanted to use those image rights and pay them virtually nothing at all, and essentially put them out of work. And that's the reality of today's political economy. Like, one of the things that I think will shadow an entire conversation about AI and ethics is the sort of political economy of the situation. That the world that we're living in now is that these big tech companies and also large corporations like Hollywood corporations are very, very powerful. And the only real counterweight to that is people working together to protect those rights. So in the case of publishers, writers are working with their publishers to protect their own rights, because that's the model that exists in that industry. But writers have also tried to step outside that and work together and semi-unionize in order to protect their content, because I think they don't fully trust their publishers to protect that content from AI, from big tech companies. And it's been proven that those companies have used a lot of literature and other forms of writing up to now. So I think that's more what we're going to see. We're going to see creators. I mean, this is the difficulty, because creativity is by nature a sort of individual practice to a large extent. And so, I think a lot of creators aren't necessarily used to working together outside of like acting and certain kinds of script writing, things like that, where there's a little bit more history. But that's how things are going to have to go. People are going to have to protect their own rights, I think, and not expect institutions to do it for them.
And to bring it to the open source point that Mina brought up there, I want to bring you in on that, Susan. Do you think like the open source model of AI development can sustain in the face of the development that's happening commercially? Because I know Llama is open source and that's Meta's model, but I think they really the big tech companies want to have control over this so that they control the money, really.
This is a big debate, and I think I don't know that I'm qualified to talk too much in detail about it, but there's a debate going on now. It's like, so this is all of our data. So, these models basically take the internet, which as a society, mostly Western societies have uploaded all sorts of things, photos, blogs, newspapers, everything there, taken it all, and you build a big model out of it. So the question is, should that be open source, or should it be companies, proprietary to companies? So you can use them, but you can't take them and, deploy them yourself. So there's one group of people think these foundation models or large language models, whatever you want to call them, are so dangerous, and they are showing such, progressing so fast that actually it will be too risky to release these, that it needs to be controlled somewhat. And is it better that it's in tech companies that have to follow some regulations? Because, some people, so there's that, and there's other people saying, no, release it. It's better, then everyone can work on it. So I don't know. So AI regulation, for example, in the AI Act, it was added in the trilogue negotiations just before last Christmas that if you're a language model and you're producing, if you're a provider of an AI generated AI content generator, whatever image or even text, it has to be watermarked, or it has to be clearly labeled as coming from AI. That kind of thing is probably a lot easier to implement if you have a few companies who have the models and you can regulate them. But if it's open source, the argument is then it's the Wild West altogether, and you have models who are built to, create kind of misinformation and disinformation and totally flood online platforms in a way that we can't control. Not that we can control much of it now, but that would be a next level out of control. So that's the debate.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what's the right answer. Brian might
But
have an
it's
opinion.
it's a really good point to make, because open source in theory sounds great, but it's kind of like what I say about the internet being this tool of democratization or whatever, because it's like anyone can build a website and share their message online, but change the tone of that. Anyone can build a website and share their messages online. Like, that's not always someone with the most valiant of purposes. And I know, Brian, you have actually been involved with the task force that's about kind of like creating a healthier online world for us. How's that going? When are you going to be ready?
Any day now. And I think that I guess that's in the background of a lot of this, that if we look, and the internet is a great example of like a relatively recent explosion of a new technology and what happened. And I think there's a pretty sensible view that we got an awful amount of stuff wrong. And we got an awful amount of stuff wrong around business models. We got an awful amount of stuff wrong around regulation. And we live now in a kind of an unpleasant internet. And if I'm old enough to remember, I actually remember going to college first. I did computer science, and we were allowed access to the internet before anybody else in college. It made us unusually popular for computer scientists because it was felt, as computer scientists, we needed to see this new thing and see what it became. And you can really see there's a real sort of curve of early internet. It was all very nice. It was people putting up their page about Star Trek. And there's 100 great Star Trek facts and this kind of thing. And then it sort of moved across to actually something that became quite useful, where people started, we got Amazon and we got shopping and we got interesting things happening. And then we got the nice social media, and that seemed great. And suddenly you could connect to people and you could find all your old friends. And then we've come to a kind of in some places unusable, very strange, kind of dangerous thing that we have now. And I think the real lesson to take from that is to see, can we learn from that in terms of AI? We look at open source, we look at business models, not make those same mistakes essentially at the moment. And I think the open source thing is really interesting. You were saying about how it works. I think people are tangling themselves up in knots to find new definitions. So those models, they're not quite open source. They're open weights, I think, is the latest kind of phrase
I'm
that
pretty
people
sure
are
that's how
coming up
Lama
with.
describes
Yeah,
it.
and it's kind of people trying to tangle them up in knots. My understanding is that the first meta one was released by mistake by somebody, and then somebody said, we should just try and make this a good thing that we're going to do.
We
Let's
did
make
that
this
on
a
purpose,
strategy
actually.
now. And I think, and part of it is a differentiator and trying to jump up and down and say, we're doing something different. So I think that if we look at kind of where we're going with AI, I think if we could learn a lot of those lessons from what happened with the internet and try and avoid those kind of horrible places, that'd be a good thing. It's not clear though how you do it, because exactly as Susan was saying.
Sounds like we don't know how, but some sort of way forward involves transparency a bit more.
Yeah, I
like
was
less
just going to
black
say
box.
the word transparency, you don't have to release a model to the world for anyone to use it, so maybe you build a licensing system, that only certain people can use it, but also transparency. Even like nobody knows the training data on these, so it could be open source, but you don't know what the ingredients are. So that refining the definition of what's open, there's a lot of work to be done. And my opinion would be that we could make grave mistakes by perhaps rushing to release these openly. So maybe a licensing system or something like that.
One big difference between the early internet and the move into the privatization of the internet that happened in the 2000s is that the companies that became the big monopolies, they were only in formation at that point. So I absolutely agree mistakes were made in terms of how that was regulated. There was misunderstanding of what they were, also kind of a cynical understanding of what they were, that they weren't publishers, that they, that was a really important move to make them not publishers so that they weren't responsible for the content. The difference now is that it's those companies who are also doing the AI push, and they are massive monopolies. So we're in a very different world to that world of the 90s, early 2000s in terms of the ability to control what the companies do and to regulate them. So it's like, it's not the same situation, is all I'm saying, in terms of where we are now and where we were then. And those mistakes are really kind of cumulative in a way, and they make it harder. Sorry to be a bit doomsday about it, but they make it harder to kind of get it right this time around. And who is going to do the getting it right? Like the EU, we've mentioned the EU AI Act a few times, which is definitely one of the more progressive legislative moves that's been made in this area. But it's notably coming from the EU, where the tech isn't actually being made. So, it's very important for Europe to be a counterweight in this area, but really we need to see this happening also in the US and in China.
I do definitely want to come back to that point, but I want to bring us to something hopeful for a moment. So, there are examples of AI being put to work in a way that is good for people, has good outcomes, and is done so responsibly because it's heavily regulated, and that's in medicine. Because you really don't get to do things in medicine unless you're, adhering to certain ethics, board approvals, and all sorts of regulatory hurdles to get through. And there's a good reason for that. And they still make mistakes there, but they try to mitigate as much of that as possible. And I know, Mina, that's an area that you have a lot of experience in. And when you're nodding your head and saying transparency would be good, licensing would be good, are there examples in the medical field that can show us the best practice of applying AI?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, in the context of healthcare, there are several examples how AI would benefit patient, would increase access to medicine for patient. For example, in one case, these targeted therapies for cancers, so they're already on the market, but just for a small number of people because they're very expensive. So AI would help to increase this access to people who in a normal situation do not have this access. Or for example, there are several apps would benefit patient. For example, there is an app, Be My Eyes. So it's using ChatGPT and connecting with an assistant. They can literally be eye for someone who is visually impaired. Or there are several examples, or for example, in UCD, there is a successful project of Professor Maguire about detecting preeclampsia in pregnant women using AI and large language models. But also in the context of healthcare, I think in general and in healthcare also, there are three narratives. One is utopian, like AI would benefit all the society, would increase access to medicine for patients, would replace in the near future, for example, in radiology would. That is not true completely, but they argue that because these advancements in these fields were remarkable. Or, for example, in the pharmaceutical sector, so AI would help in designing, developing, producing all these pharmaceutical products. There is a recent agreement between OpenAI and Moderna about designing and producing. And the Moderna's CEO mentioned that if we wanted to do this in an old traditional pharmaceutical industry method, we would need 100,000 employees. But with AI, just make our life so much easier. This is utopia. But also there is a dystopia, that's a dystopian world, that these using AI, even in these healthcare content. There are several examples, several cases. For example, in the US, before even these hype of LLMs, before that, there are a number of cases about predictive AI using in hospital that would increase biases against, for example, people of color, against minorities. There were some cases of gender biases. And all of these would bring us to the third narrative. Maybe AI has something positive in the future, has some positive roles, but also at the same times, we have to be cautious about these negative points, specifically about using this AI in a high-risk sector, because according to the EU AI Act, using AI in the healthcare context is considered a high-risk usage of AI.
Yeah, of course, because of the risk it can cause harm. So that is an example of, if we use AI, we can actually get good outcomes, and not even in a utopian way. Like, just there's many ways you can apply AI in healthcare that can be good for people. But there is then environmental cost with AI as well. So they say that a ChatGPT query has maybe 4 times the carbon footprint of like a Google search. And if people are using it at the scale that they want us to be using it, like, that's going to have quite an energy cost. And I'm just wondering, maybe Susan, on a policy level, is that something that's being hashed out and raised? Or Brian, at the scientific level, is that a concern? I mean, the environmental cost is big, but is it at the table when people are talking about development here?
Yeah, again, I have a colleague who would be able to answer this really well. It's his area. So I'm going to be quoting him a lot. The last time I heard a talk about this is that the actual numbers aren't really clear. There's not, again, transparency into this, but there is doing a search on ChatGPT versus Google, it's multiple more times the carbon footprint. But technology, so does saving photos from your phone to a cloud, or we do so many things. So does wanting all our emails to be stored since 2006. And taking photos of children, 20 times a day. So there's so much in tech, it feels invisible, and it's not. So there is a lot of work at the moment going on, putting a number on that. And we all have to take responsibility, I suppose, and see all we do digitally the same as, putting on the kettle or turning on, having shorter showers and all that. It's the same kind of thing, but there's no transparency. It's a bit invisible. So there's a lot of work to be done to put numbers on it. Numbers I don't know. Maybe Brian does.
Yeah, no, and I guess from a technical point of view, there's a huge amount of work going on to try to fix that. Taking the neural net analogy that people have a little bit too far, there's an algorithm called optimal brain damage, which is an interesting name for an algorithm, but it's all about trying to take those giant models and recognizing the fact that they're way bigger than they need to be. So can you trim them down to basically make them much smaller, make them much more efficient? There's a whole area called frugal machine learning, looking at doing that. So it's one of the areas that we do some work in, basically trying to either build up algorithms and models to only be as big as they need to be, or take great big models and shrink them right down to be basically only as big as they need to be effective. We do some work with Railtra, a space engineering company, to put those models in satellites in space where there's no power and there's no bandwidth and there's no communication. So can you make them as small as you possibly can in order to do that? And there's a nice sort of side effect of that, going back to data and copyright and things, around that whole idea of frugal ML, is that maybe scale isn't the big thing. So there's a big idea in machine learning that basically scale is all you need, is the phrase that people say. So you do bigger data sets, bigger models, more computers, and everything will get better and better and better. There's interesting arguments going on now that maybe that curve is starting to top out. Now, there have been interesting arguments saying that for a while, and it hasn't. But maybe it's going to top out. But the view around frugal machine learning is that there's another way that maybe if we used more carefully designed models, smaller, sort of curated, probably legal data sets, and more efficient algorithms, we could get very similar performance without that massive energy footprint, essentially, and with a lot of those bad things around the use of massive data sets without copyright and things like that. The challenge now is the small models aren't as good as the big ones. So right now scale is leading, but there's a race there, and it is really catching up. So I think there's a big technical solution to that coming, and people doing really interesting work on figuring out that sort of slightly smaller, more carefully built models.
I love the name Frugal ML.
Yeah.
That's very exciting to me as a prospect, because I do think in general we do need to be a bit more conscious of our digital detritus. You know, we see it as invisible and it's not, it has a footprint, and that can be big. But it feels like the reason why they can make these massive models and continue to scale them to like it beyond even the imaginations that they had themselves is because they're getting a lot of money to do so, and they can extend the compute as long as the money keeps going in there. And Mina, an argument that comes up a lot when it comes to regulation and innovation is that regulation stymies innovation. Now, I would say I think those people don't understand what innovation is, because surely innovation is when you do something creative within the limitations of what you have. And these people seem to be operating without limits in many ways. So what would you say to people who try to put that argument out there that it's going to stop the development and stop innovation?
Thank you. So I guess this question doesn't have an answer because it's just a big argument between pro-innovation and pro-regulation in all different aspects, in all different industry. For example, because I'm working, my research is about pharmaceuticals, I give you a message from pharmaceuticals. So for pharmaceuticals, patent protection and also extension of these patent protection for years, it's one of the arguments is that it's really necessary for the innovation, for incentive to innovate. And even though some of these blockbusters, like this patent protection is not just for 20 years, so they try to extend this by like reformulating and then apply for another patent and another one and another one. So some of these blockbusters, like for example, Humira, for many years after expiration of these, the original patent, still access to this medicine is not available for many patients. So the arguments of pharmaceutical companies is just innovation. And any change in these regards, there are just really several arguments from the industry against that. And this innovation argument is also very strong in tech companies. But my question is that, so if all of these related to incentive to innovate and there is no regulation, who would be responsible for this damage that some of these AI, they have there were several cases. For example, there were a case in the Netherlands that using AI in social welfare cases, it just like the result was a disaster. Thousands of people, thousands of families, like because of this failure, affected.
A number of years, they were denied benefits that they should have been entitled to, and they were not getting any recourse when they tried to contact people about it. And by the time this came to light, people had their lives destroyed. And it did come to light, and it actually took down the Dutch government when it did. Like this actually is a great example of, you know, when this thing can go wrong. And I'm really interested that you brought up that idea of the pharmaceutical companies and patents, because yes, they are trying to protect their innovation, but it's because it's innovation for profit. I mean, no one's going to make money from curing diseases. So will we get the good out of this? Adam, you're skeptical. I know you'll have an answer for that.
Well, no, I mean, to me, this is the big question: is innovation for what? At the end of the day, like, what's the purpose of all of this? I just on something you said earlier, which is very smart, Elaine, that like innovation depends upon restrictions and limitations. You innovate within frame, and that's me. You know who the resistant. That's what art is. So art is an artist takes a form and innovates within that form because they understand the history of that form. The problem with our contemporary technologies, it's underpinned by a libertarian ethos in which freedom needs to be absolute and there needs to be no limitations, and that's the model of society that underpins all of this. But the question we have to ask is like, okay, we might be innovating within computing, or even as I said earlier, in terms of language, these things are really very interesting, but it's happening very fast. There are huge consequences to it, and it doesn't seem to me that the end game is in any way clear as to like how this is going to make society better, particularly on the generative side. Like the healthcare one that you mentioned earlier is one that people point to all the time, but even Mina has even raised questions with that, and that's kind of a best case scenario. I must say I do struggle to understand in the generative AI area, like what the use cases are going to be that are really going to improve human life based on these innovations. But since the 19th century, we've had this idea that progress and moral and political progress and technological progress are kind of hand in hand. Like that's something we've believed for 200 years. And I think there's a skepticism about that now, that for the first time, really, like broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of people who are skeptical about these new models and, what are they going to bring to humans? So yeah, this is an open question, but it's a very important one.
They might be skeptical, but a lot of people are using them. So I think people embrace them. They're developed because people use them. Students use them. They find them helpful. What we do and what we say can often be two very different things. So yeah.
But that ethos Adam's talking about there, like that's an ethos that I know is coming from the people in charge of big tech. I mean, it's the move fast and break things, ask permission, not forgiveness. Or sorry, ask forgiveness, not permission. They don't ask permission. Because they are controlling, are leading the development. And even you mentioned, Susan, as well, like that it's a largely Western internet that they're taking their data from, stuff like that, because that's what they're familiar with. That's what they know. That's what they're happy to interpret. And when it comes to, say, different languages, even niche languages, they actually, even their own moderation tools that are guided by AI really start to struggle because they're not as interested in that.
Yeah, and there's a new project in the EU to develop a EU language model, so that is more culturally diverse and has different languages as well. There's another one our colleague Barry Sullivan is involved in, an Irish language model. So you can ask questions in Irish and it'll generate Irish. Wish that was around when I was doing my Leaving Cert. So there is moves to like those American companies creating these models. It's culture. They're always culturally specific, situated. These we can't expect them to be able to speak Irish, or so we build our own, and Europe is building one with that represents cultures more appropriately.
Yeah, I did. I was toying around with Notebook LM, and I created a little podcast, a threat to my artwork, and it said Dunsha for Donica, which an American might make that mistake as well. But then they also said, "What's the crake?" So Hiberno English is still safe from these
for sure.
models.
Yeah,
but like I mean, when it comes to ethics and things like that, I suppose it's always a question of power as well, and like who controls these things. And I mean, Brian, it would be great if this was more in the hands of like research and science and stuff like that. Not that your sector is perfect, but it's probably seen as a bit more trustworthy to be handling this. But I know that you actually, you work with industry as well. So like, what's your view there?
So I think that balance, I guess, is the key thing. And there's a nice book, people might know, the American journalist Kara Swisher. She recently wrote a book about Silicon Valley, and the opening line is, it was all about money after all, and is kind of holding up a lot of the companies who talk about we're going to change the world and make it a better place. And yeah, sometimes, but at the same time, it's corporations who are there to make money. And I think that's a really interesting space for us, though, where we are that bit more trustworthy. We do have slightly different goals. We have slightly different objectives to look at, I guess, that broader suite of use cases of AI, so the different things that you can do with it. And I guess yes, definitely with generative AI in particular, there's an awful lot of rubbish use cases, and people waste an awful lot of time, an awful lot of energy, an awful lot of money just generating another bad haiku or a limerick or something, or another silly picture or something. But there are massive, really interesting deployments of AI that are making a difference. So a really simple one is on Zoom calls. You can generate subtitles automatically, and that opens up those calls to a huge audience who are completely locked out of that. That's a brilliant use of generative AI. It's exactly the same technologies that's doing the other translations. Translation in language in itself, not always perfect, but again, opens up conversations, opens up access to things. The health examples that we talked about, it's kind of amazing. And I think this is a thing we shouldn't forget. We have a satiation that we sort of get used to new technology awfully quickly. The fact that we're talking about this is amazing, that these techniques exist. But in the hospitals just out the road, there are systems now doing the idea of opportunistic screening. So if you're in an emergency room, if you get a CT scan because you've fallen down the stairs, the doctor who's looking after that, their only concentration is basically looking after the fact that you've fallen down the stairs. But there's a bunch of things that you can see in that CT scan. But the doctor's not going to spend any time with those. They don't have any time. And even if they did spend the time to see them, you've fallen down the stairs. So you're not interested in anything else. But essentially, opportunistic screening systems can look at all those images, screen them for a bunch of interesting things that you can see in those, and then raise a flag to say, okay, in 6 months' time, when you've gotten over the fact that you've fallen down the stairs, you need to come in because your calcium buildup in your carotid artery is too high, and we need to fix that. And there's loads of really interesting things like that that people can build out and look at. And I think that's where, in universities, I think we have a job to do to make sure that we're looking at different, more interesting, better use cases. I know I have this conversation, sometimes my wife gives out to me for working in a university and saying, well, why don't you go and get a job in one of these advertising companies?
Get a real job.
Make a bunch of money selling ads online with AI. And it's a good point, and maybe we should, but at the same time, we should be doing other things. And I think that's what we can do in a university in AI. We can do those other things that then sometimes it's a ripple and sometimes it's a small ripple against a big machine, but those things do make it out and can make a difference.
And can I add to that as well? I think it's important to, at this point, distinguish the technology. So that there's certain risks associated with some kind of AI that aren't with others. So, there's issues of bias and discrimination that have come up with a certain kind of machine learning model. It's different type of bias and discrimination in a generative AI. There's different risks. So, and we can take places where it went wrong and think, well, that's all of AI. But AI is massive. It's just like saying technology. It's so everywhere. So I think it's incumbent on the conversation to get a bit more specific about what AI means. Is it generative AI? The risks, for example, in making decisions about people's lives, people's health, people's access to social welfare, people's access to a job and education. Those are the domains that really affect people's fundamental human rights. And that is not generative AI. It is kind of traditional kind of, you take data and make the same kind of decisions again. If you see new data, like you're finding, you're in a company, you have a load of CVs, you want to find, okay, who made it to the top in management and get me more of them. And so if you look back the last 20 years, it'll find who got to management 20 years ago. And it's not always because they were good. So it'll repeat those injustices. That's not generative AI. Generative AI is different. In generative AI, the risk is it's language and images. It's how we communicate as humans. So what happens when we read something or we see something, we don't know who created that. Is that person real? Is that voice real? What's real? What's not? So that kind of that is a fundamental intervening in society in a totally different way. And the AI Act very much focuses on those human rights violations because of decisions learned from historical data. So I think it's important to be more specific, because AI in general is too huge a topic and it's too varied and it carries different risks.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point about like we are trying to cover AI and that's a lot of things. It's like trying to talk about all of tech in one session. But we are nearly at the end of this part of the Q&A. I have one final question for Mina and Adam. And while I am asking them that, we'll have two mics roving around. If you want to raise your hand, if you have a question of your own, they will get to you, and wait until the mic gets to you before you ask your question. But Mina and Adam, the points raised by Brian and Susan there had me thinking, even with opportunistic screening, the idea of we have to get into an environment for that to happen. Someone has to consent that the screening can be used for more than what they've asked for it to do. So there's like that data sharing element to it. We're going to need to get to a point of being able to trust these technologies and to trust these providers that we can give that consent and get something good for us back from it. And I know that's something that like you're conscious of in healthcare, and Adam in your work in digital trust. So I'd love to get both of you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, in the context of healthcare, as you mentioned, the consent is very important. So for training these data sets, for creating these data sets by training data and creating an AI system, we need patient information and patient data. But there are some other regulations like GDPR that you cannot do this without their consent. So there are some theories, for example, they argue that between private rights and public rights, when there is a conflict, so you have to prioritize public rights over private rights. But it's not that easy. So GDPR is one of the regulation that many people who works in hospitals, in the healthcare system, and they want to train data to create like some application to increase access to medicine or access to healthcare services for patients. They have these obstacles. So at the EU level, there right now there are some proposals about who would encourage using secondary data, because there is also this difference between primary data and secondary data. So you can use the secondary data for training this AI system. But this conflict between private rights and public rights is a very critical issue who should be fixed in order to increase this access.
Trust is something I've got a project on and I'm very interested in, and I'll give two levels of answer here. I mean, on one side, people learning what consent is for them and understanding better what it means for them to consent and to trust or distrust. I mean, to me, that's something literature helps us to do, and that's one of the reasons I teach it. I mean, only 3 hours ago, I was teaching a short story by Octavia Butler, a science fiction writer, called Bloodchild, which is about a very problematic case of consent in a kind of science fictional world. And one of the things that you talked about in the class, the students talked about, is how the story models a form of consent and thinking about what consent is and what trust is and whether trust can actually happen in certain kinds of situations of imbalance of power. So that's one of the things literature does to help us to actually think about consent and trust. But the other point I want to make on this is that the very technologies that we're talking about, regulation, have eaten into the capacities of our people's belief in regulation and in the kind of institutions and public bodies that do that kind of regulating. So social media in particular, we all know this, that it's sown mistrust in all kinds of institutions, in all kinds of like governments and science and journalism and everything. So it has produced a situation where it's difficult to kind of come back and say, well, we need to regulate these, because the people who use those technologies less believe that that's actually the way to handle them, because the technologies themselves mitigate against that. So it's a complex feedback loop that's happening for me with 21st century technology. That's where we need to intervene somehow with, as I say, a kind of very developed understanding of what these questions of consent and trust mean philosophically and also like personally for us.
On the social media, I think if we have the Digital Services Act as well as the Digital Markets Act and now the AI Act, so I think, and they're just being implemented. So my hope is that very soon the landscape of risk in terms of the online platforms. So again, recommender systems. So one kind of AI system. That's if for anyone who uses those kind of systems to watch the news or use a TikTok or Instagram, whatever. That's, AI trying to figure you out and recommend you content that you want to see. And there's risks to that, because what we end up watching isn't always good for us or what we want to be watching. So there's a lot of, if you don't know about it, the Digital Services Act has been implemented, and hopefully the landscape will be safer. And it is trying to address that misinformation. And with the AI Act, there's an awful lot. And I think I have to say, like, Europe globally is a real leader on this. And I think I'm very hopeful that the future will be much better, and that kids getting their first phone in a couple of years' time won't be in the danger that they are in now. So I think I'm kind of very proud of what Europe is doing right now, I think, in trying to regulate technology.
And do we have questions from the crowd? Do we have one over here?
Thanks very much.
There's a person at the back as well for the next question. No, I was just saying for the next one.
So open source, is that meaningful anymore? Should we actually, when the source doesn't tell you how the model is actually going to make a decision, should we be talking about open access to data? And should we be considering the compute to be a public resource with everything that goes into it, with the water, with the resources that go in? Is it an open resource? And that'll be a question for all four of you in line.
I can start if you want. I think a trick has been pulled in calling those models open source, because they're not open source. They're more open than other models. But I think if we're not going to talk about the details of the data that went in to train them, the processes used to do them, the alignment processes that were used after that, all of that is still wrapped up in clouds of secrecy and obfuscation and things. So I think we really shouldn't be using the term open source, because that's not what they are. There's a version of this. There are genuine open source efforts to build genuinely open source models. They do come against challenges of resources. It costs a bunch of money to do these, but there's some really interesting efforts around building sort of genuinely open source models. I think there's a trick being pulled in using that term, because it's not really what those models are at the moment.
Especially with Llama. I mean, specifically they designed it so they get taken up by open source requirements. But it's not in any way, like, I know what source code is, I don't know what it's going to do. So what is the meaning of having the source code?
It is interesting. So they are different, and they are different, I think, in interesting ways. And opening up the weights of the models and things allows you to do things, and it does allow more transparency than you do have when you have no access to the model. But it is a slightly different thing. I think that's kind of interesting how that discussion is going to pan out.
And the abuse of terms in tech is already well known with the cloud, which is a giant data center. Did you have something to add there?
Actually, it was on that point that the final thing that was said there about resources going in, and the idea that they are free somehow, that, like, water or air or anything, like, that's a big mistake. The resources of our planet are public, and it would be a whole different thing if these companies actually have to pay for what they're using. Things would look very, very different if they had to pay the real value of what those things cost to humans as in terms of resource use. So I think that's a great point.
And we had a question at the back here.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really lovely. Enjoyed it. So my question goes this way. When we talk about AI ethics, is there an aspect of that is he who pays the piper dictates the tune? And I say this because I listened to Dr. Brian there. He alluded to us learning lessons from internet so that we don't make the same mistakes with AI. But you would agree with me that if internet or the likes of social media, Facebook, were invented by Iran, for instance, there are so many things on social media today that we wouldn't have, simply because Iran invented it. So now when we talk about AI and ethics, the majority of the large language models that AI trains off comes from the West. So who decides this ethics? Who decides what is safe and for who? Thank you.
Oh, even everyone in the crowd says that's a great question, and I agree. Very well put. Anyone got anything to? It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean,
who is in charge?
You know, I mean, just one small way to answer that would be to think about the way in which like the large companies utilize labor in the global south in order to like tag or you know cleanse the language that goes in, the data that goes in. You know, this has been invented in a moment of like deep inequality in the world, a global system, but a global and extremely unequal system. So you're absolutely right. I mean, those who pay the money make the tune, and those who have to accept the who have no choice in a way but to accept the kind of conditions under which they work are what we now call the global south. That's what happens, and you know, and we all know those stories. They're horrific. Some of the idea of taking like images, horrific images, and processing those. All of that is done out of sight of the West, so to speak. And Susan made this point earlier that one of the major challenges for us with big tech is how much of it is invisible. I was just talking about the resource use. You know, and the labor is the other thing. You know, the labor that goes into this is actually huge, but mostly invisible to those of us who are the end users. And that is a real important challenge, I think, to kind of get our heads around and actually rethink how, I mean, as Susan said earlier, like we as consumers also need to think about what it means for us to use these technologies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's not as automated as we think it is. That all that data has to be labeled. And we don't know what the labels are, who's labeling it, who comes up with the labels.
Yeah, and there's incredible work going on in analysis of those data sets by Bebe Berhane, who's now a UN advisor in AI. And she has spoken to this idea of kind of like a digital feudalism coming out of this. Is it also that the questions we're asking in terms of the ethics of AI are also being dictated by, you know, voices in the West and stuff like that? And I'm curious of your input on this, Susan, because like you're in an international, you know, group trying to address these issues and hash them out. So do we need to make sure that more voices are at that table as well?
What table? In that, like there are global technologies made primarily in America at the moment in Silicon Valley, you know, taking data that was produced because it's from the internet. It's America has most of the data up there, you know, and it's Western data for sure. But then it's global, and then the regulation of that is not global. Okay, so the EU is taking what I think is a very strong approach in certain areas. But after that, it's quite fragmented. You mentioned China earlier. They've kind of are taking a very hardline approach against generative AI because it's so so there's different approaches for different countries, you know, but there are countries perhaps that are vulnerable. Vulnerable, like if your culture and your language and how you think is not represented in these models and you start using them, what effect does that have? Does it start influencing and changing and bringing this kind of Western viewpoint to situations where it's not appropriate culturally? Because if you test, especially computer vision, for example, it does produce stereotypes in terms of gender or race. Like show me images of, you know, pick a profession and it will repeat stereotypes. Same with the language models, but less so because we have a lot more research trying to mitigate those kind of issues. But it is, especially with the generative vision, very culturally as biased as you'd expect if you took the internet. So there is no, and there's some people are arguing for a CERN of AI, like a kind of global centralized way to address this. That's one option. But I think coordinating that, like it's moving so fast, it needs to be very quick. And gaining consensus can be difficult. So we have a few different, we have a few kind of different global initiatives and bodies that have different roles in that. Like the UN produces ethical guidelines that gets political buy-in for every country. You know, so different global multilateral organizations have a different role, but there's no global regulation. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah. And then there's one at the back of it, but we'll fit you in as well after.
Hi, I'm a secondary school teacher, so my interest is in minors, people who are under 18, and we're talking about the future. And I just haven't heard any talk of children. But I just wanted to kind of raise one point. You mentioned human rights, and you're right, Susan, like we need to distinguish between all the different types of AI, and obviously the pharmaceutical, the healthcare industry, and the case in the Netherlands affecting human rights. But I think LLMs, I think they are strongly connected with human rights. You know, if educators are using AI, for example, to generate lesson plans, or, you know, the popular discourse now, the hype is all about using AI to help with administrative tasks in schools, this is affecting our children's rights. Are our children getting equal rights to education? What about the right to non-discrimination? And what about their rights to privacy? You hear stories of people using AI to help them write emails, for example, and inputting in emails into ChatGPT, and they're taking out the names, and they think that's protecting data. And I would disagree. I wouldn't like that as a parent of two teenagers to think my emails were being fed to LLM machines. So I just want to know what you think of where it's going for schools at second level, and maybe just a little bit more about human rights and LLMs. Thank you.
I'd love to. I know I answered this is the last one. I'd love to answer this one. I think it's so important. I think children, teenagers especially, are the main users. They use AI more than any of us here. They get, you know, how many hours do they spend on their phones, you know? And I am concerned about LLMs, ChatGPT and the likes in secondary schools, for example. And it has all this promise of being able to take a text and translate it into something appropriate for different learners, for sure. It has great potential. But if, for example, it could be used in class to generate an assignment, because what you're trying to teach often at secondary level is what something like ChatGPT can do, you know, quite easily, like compare and contrast something and something else. That type of teaching, I think it presents a real challenge, especially for things like continuous learning. Do we have to bring back to exams, you know? And I think that really needs to be thought through. And I'd imagine that teachers need a lot of help, and there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done, and there needs to be a national strategy on this, because otherwise it's the students that need the support that will use it in a way perhaps that doesn't support them, you know. And also the other one is recommender algorithms, which is a whole other thing where AI sends them content that is not, stereotypes them, I guess, and it's kind of going backwards. But
I know that's a lot of your work has been looking at recommender algorithms. So I wondered, do you have anything to weigh in on there?
Yeah, no, I think so. So I think you're absolutely right. Like it's not going to be us who lives with this world and invents this new world. We've done a bunch of work on, I guess, bringing education about AI to secondary schools, and we've built programs because I think, as Susan was saying, the usage of basically online tools that are using things like AI filters, AI generated content, AI recommender systems to recommend content. The usage of those is obviously very concentrated in that demographic, and an awful lot of them are not aware that's going on in the background. I think what's really important is that critical awareness of, well, why am I seeing the thing that I'm seeing? And trying to build on top of that. I think you're absolutely right, though. There is a real danger. We talk about a promise of AI democratizing education and improving education and a personal tutor for every student. There's a real danger, and that the reality of that will be very patchy. And we'll see the same discrimination that we see, discrimination is probably the wrong word, but we'll see the same disadvantage that we see where, those things cost money, those things will be expensive. The schools that will have access to those will be the schools that have access to the other expensive supports and aids, and we won't see a broad deployment of those tools. And I think there's a real danger again that it's the same mistakes that we see again and again. So I think that the rights-based approach to that is an interesting one to think about, and an interesting one to really make sure that we get right. And I think in education, in all of these, and anything that I've ever studied or learned about education, an awful lot of it boils down to small numbers of personal interactions. We talk about in the university, there's loads of studies that look at people's university experience, and one of the big sort of factors in determining whether people have, let's say, good university experience or bad ones is a small number of sort of key interactions with peers and educators. And I think there's a danger that we start to design some of those out of the systems, and it's at our peril, basically, that we would do that.
Yeah, I mean, I come at this partly as a parent of 3 children, 8 and under. So I hope Susan's right when she said earlier that the world of tech will change in the next few years, and it'll feel like a less scary place to be, a young person or the parent of a young person. But I would also say that one of the things that LLMs allow for is shortcuts on a lot of things, and that's the worry that students will see the short-term benefit of essentially using these things in place of doing the hard work. And the younger they are, the more important it is for them to do that hard work, for them to actually learn through trial and error and process these things themselves and actually understand how to do them. It's notable that, we've had calculators for how long. Most of us, if we need to do a sum, we'll put it in our phone, it'll be calculated. But we still teach kids how to do their times tables and their, addition and everything in school, because we recognize that that's really crucial, that everyone needs to know how to do this stuff, and they need to understand how it works. We still teach language that way. I think secondary school is the big challenge, because that's when students are really, really tech savvy. But it's the chances are that they also are thinking about leaving cert points, and it's the temptation to cheat is there. I'm calling it cheating because in a way that's what it is, but it's a very hard temptation, and it's very hard to see how to make sure that it doesn't happen. I mean, it's a hard problem, but it's a real one. In terms of rights, it's an interest. I think.
It's all right. And also thinking about what we're talking about here today is also making sure that all voices are represented, because that's more ethical. Engaging with young people on this and getting their perspective on this issue, I think, is really important. And groups like WebWise actually form councils of young people to advise them on AI. And I've spoken to some of these young people, and they are very tech savvy, but they are also very informed and very concerned about these things as well. And it's really actually, it might actually make you feel better about the future when you talk to them about it, because they are clued in, and some of them are very active in this area as well. So we had this one last question up the back, and then we will wrap up.
Hi, my question was related to regulation. Considering most of the recent AI development has come out of the US, would higher regulation put the European tech industry at a disadvantage? And if so, how do you mitigate that?
So this is the regulation stifles innovation question, but also the question of, if Europe isn't developing the AI, can it be the lead regulator? Because that's something that's also brought up as a challenge as well to EU regulation.
So thank you for your question. So there are 3 different types of regulation right now about AI. One is EU perspective, so it's horizontal regulation. It means that there are at the EU level, there are AI office, there are AI advisory boards, different layers of AI, and also in each member state there will be a competent agency for enforcing these AI regulation. At the same time, in the US, there are different approach right now. So vertical approach, it means that all the 50 agency, for example, FTC, different agencies about different industries, they will regulate different aspects of these AI. And also there are third approach in China and some parts of the world that combining these two approach. So all the countries, so there is something called Brussels effect. So after AI regulation, EU AI regulation, many countries around the globe, from global north, global south, they're trying to like drafting a regulation on AI because of all of these dangers that we talked about today. So there are like an unknown future, and also with the danger of AGI, so artificial general intelligence, who would they call it like an agent. They will do everything. So the tech companies are right now advertising that. For example, yesterday, the CEO of OpenAI announced that we will have this technology in the next 5 years. So with all these unknown future, so regulation, I think there is the only solution. So some argue that over-regulation is a problem because of that innovation. But as one of the audience mentioned, for example, in teenager, in children's rights, human rights, gender biases, racial biases, these are not, and also values in the society, these are not the topics that we just ignore for now and also for the future, because the danger is just some of these chatbots right now. For example, there was a case, a teenager were chatting with one of these LLMs about their mental health, and there were some mental health like suggestions, recommendation, and that teenager has anorexia. So there were some like diets recommended by these LLM to that teenager. So some of these, there were some cases of committing suicide after some discussion, some of conversation with these chatbots. So these are like serious topics that we cannot. It's not just about writing a poem, writing an email. It's just the danger, and also the future of these artificial general intelligence is just something that EU AI Act is, in my opinion, is the first step, but it's not enough. Even that is not enough. So on different level, different kind of regulation for different industries, for different aspects, healthcare, for human rights aspect, for social values, rights, and as Suzanne mentioned, along with other regulation like Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, we cannot just ignore all of these problems because of that innovation-based arguments.
It's a really good point. I think we can leave it on that emphatic note. That was great, Mina. A real pro-regulation stance coming there. And I mean, if innovation means all those risks, I mean, I think that's the ethical approach to take. We can concede that. So thank you so much to you guys for sitting here and listening to all of that. Thank you to Una Europa for hosting this, to Sylvia particularly for coordinating all of us together for tonight. Thank you also to Shane Lorden and the Dublin European Institute, Insight, the Research Ireland Centre for Data Analytics, all of whom contributed to make this happen. And this event is taking place as part of Science Week, which has events going on all week, lots of discussions about AI, lots of projects around AI. So check that out if you're interested in exploring this topic further, and have a safe journey home.